Reading the Times for Thursday, January 30th, 2020. Republicans move to block impeachment witnesses driving toward acquittal. Before the trial convened, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky, the majority leader, and other Republicans signaled that they were regaining confidence that they would be able to cobble together the 51 votes needed to block the witnesses and documents and bring the trial to an acquittal verdict as soon as Friday, after the revelations from Mr. Bolton reported. After the revelations from Mr. Bolton reported on Sunday by the New York Times had threatened to knock their plans off course. We've always known it will be an uphill fight on witnesses and documents because the president and Mitch McConnell put huge pressure on those folks. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, said during a break in the trial. Inside the Senate chamber, senators spent 8 hours grilling House managers and White House lawyers about the definition of obstruction, the meaning of executive privilege, the history of security aid to Ukraine, the role of Hunter Biden, son of former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., on the board of a Ukrainian energy company, the whistleblower who first raised concerns about Mr. Trump's call with the president of Ukraine, and whether, as Mr. Trump's legal team asserted, it was perfectly fine for the president to solicit damaging information about the Bidens from Ukraine. To Senate Republicans, a vote for witnesses is a vote for trouble. As Republicans lined up on Wednesday behind blocking witnesses in the trial, their reasoning reflected the worry that allowing testimony by John R. Bolton, the former National Security Advisor, whose unpublished manuscript contradicts a central part of Mr. Trump's impeachment defense, would undoubtedly lead to a cascade of other witnesses. To make something out of the 2 impeachment articles would send an incredibly bad message to every House after this, said Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, a member of the Republican leadership. If you really want to shut the Senate down, just send them a vague article of impeachment. Democrats dismissed that complaint, as well as the others raised by Republicans, saying they are simply in search of justification for failing to conduct a thorough review of the behavior of a president with a firm hold on voters who are essential to their individual political survival, as well as Republican control of the Senate. As coronavirus explodes in China, countries struggle to control its spread. More than a dozen nations with a handful of cases, including the United States, are isolating patients and monitoring their contacts, as well as screening travelers from China and urging people to postpone trips there. More than 7,700 cases of coronavirus recorded after races. 1 moment. Person-to-person transmission is occurring, and cases have turned up in several countries with people who have not visited China. We are very concerned about Africa because some of the least prepared countries for outbreaks are in Africa, Dr. Frieden said, adding, "We know the systems there to try to find and stop it are weaker than elsewhere. If efforts to contain an outbreak fail, public health authorities will focus on mitigation, dealing with the disease, and trying to minimize the harm it does to people and communities." Trump's Mideast plan leaves Palestinians with few options. With only muted reaction from Arab neighbors, a struggling Palestinian economy, little apparent appetite among Palestinians for a violent response, and the United States having abandoned any pretense to neutral mediation, a proposal that might have been considered outlandish a decade ago landed with little serious opposition. Rather than fighting back, some Palestinian activists on Wednesday were saying the best option might be breaking up Palestinian Authority, leaving Israel to assume the burden of providing for the West Bank's 2.5 million Palestinians. If you don't care for the Palestinians, at least care for yourselves. The assorted calls for action from Palestinian activists, thinkers, and analysts eager to shake up the prevailing inertia, sounded like variations on a theme of admitting the failure of the Palestinian Authority to grow into a state. As other Democrats feud, Bloomberg hammers Trump on healthcare. His campaign has spent $41.3 million airing one ad more than 46,000 times. It starts with a video clip of Mr. Trump saying, "Let Obamacare implode." Another ad focusing on pre-existing conditions quickly got under Mr. Trump's skin, prompting him to falsely claim in a post on Twitter that I was the person who saved pre-existing conditions in your health care. Operatives for Mr. Trump's campaign confirmed that their own internal poll shows a strong Democratic advantage on health care. A spokeswoman for Mr. Trump's campaign defended the president's record, claiming he has protected Americans with pre-existing conditions by offering affordable health care with choice and patient-guided decision-making. She also pointed to steps he's taken to give people access to short-term, limited-duration plans and association health plans. But under the law, these cheaper plans are not required to cover pre-existing conditions. Mr. Trump has for years sought the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which includes a rule that people cannot be denied coverage or charge higher premiums because of their health status. Both practices used to be widespread. The second half of Mr. Bloomberg's ad broadly touches on his own healthcare platform, announced in December. American life expectancy rises for the first time in 4 years. The death rate from fentanyl rose by 10% in 2018, and early data suggests it kept rising last year, though not as sharply as before, with the fentanyl death rate still climbing, along with the deaths involving cocaine and psychostimulants like methamphetamine. It is not clear whether the overall drop will be sustained. The increase in life expectancy might have been greater if not for rising mortality due to influenza and pneumonia. The death rate grew by 4.2%, as well as suicide and nutritional deficiencies. Asylum seekers find a new route to Europe, flowing into a divided Cyprus. You've landed on a territory of the Republic of Cyprus, but it's not until you've gone through the border check at the Green Line, which isn't the border itself, that you're officially in the Republic of Cyprus, he said. On the flip side, Turkey did not acknowledge the internationally recognized government of the Republic of Cyprus in Nicosia, which means that the agreement between the European Union and Turkey on migrants de facto cuts out Cyprus. Although some asylum seekers reach southern Cyprus by air or boat from Lebanon, Syria, or Turkey, an overwhelming majority come overland from the north, the authorities say. EU recommends limiting, but not banning, Huawei in 5G rollout. The European Union told its members on Wednesday that they should limit so-called high-risk 5G vendors, a category that includes the Chinese tech giant Huawei, but stopped short of recommending a ban on the firm, despite a lengthy and aggressive campaign by the Trump administration. The recommendations are as far as the European Union can go in dictating policy to its member nations, whose governments have the final word on whether and how they want to let Huawei help build their next generation of wireless telecommunications networks. We can do great things with 5G, said Margrethe Vestager, a top official of the European Commission, the European Union's executive body. Temperatures at a Florida-sized glacier in Antarctica alarm scientists. Scientists in Antarctica have recorded for the first time unusually warm water beneath a glacier the size of Florida that is already melting and contributing to a rise in sea levels. The researchers working on the Thwaites Glacier recorded water temperature at the base of the ice of more than 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, above the normal freezing point. To observe activity beneath the glacier, Dr. Holland's team drilled a hole from the surface to the bottom and then deployed equipment that measures water temperature and ocean turbulence, or the mixing of fresh water from the glacier and salty ocean water. Putin partons, American-Israeli, swept up in geopolitical game. The woman, Nama Isacher, was arrested in April after Russian officials said they found marijuana in her luggage during an airline stopover in Moscow while en route from India to Israel. During the visit, the Russian president met with Miss Isacher's mother, Yafa Isacher, and told her that everything will be okay. Mr. Putin's visit coincided with Israel's decision to hand over to Russia the ownership of an important religious building in central Jerusalem, one which belonged to the Russian Orthodox Church. In his decree, Mr. Putin portrayed the pardon as a gesture of goodwill, guided by the principles of humanity. Mr. Netanyahu thanked the Russian leader in a statement that called the Trump plan the deal of the century. Mr. Isacher, who was born in New Jersey, but Miss Isacher, who was born in New Jersey but lives in Israel, was still being held late Wednesday, though officials said they expected her to be freed on Thursday. In India, protesters and Modi tussle over who can claim Gandhi. The protesters, who are challenging Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu-centric vision for India, liberally evoked the legacy of a national icon, Mohandas K. Gandhi, who wanted a country where Hindu and Muslims lived together and a secular government kept the peace. Modi invokes everything about Gandhi except Hindu-Muslim harmony, and this is the most crucial element of his work, said Ramachandra Guha, a historian who wrote an authoritative biography of Gandhi and who was arrested at a recent protest. You cannot have Darwin without evolution, and you can't have Gandhi without Hindu-Muslim harmony. Clashes broke out at some early protests, but more recent demonstrations have been peaceful, deliberately drawing on Gandhi's example of nonviolent resistance. Despite calm in Afghan cities, war in villages kills dozens daily. The pattern of violence in recent months have been tied closely to how negotiations between the United States and the Taliban held in the Gulf state of Qatar have played out. As the United States has pushed for more from the Taliban at the negotiating table in recent weeks, the insurgents are growing mistrustful, accusing the Americans of moving the goalposts. The Taliban officials say the United States has recently asked for a violence reduction, which they brought to the table after a month of consultations, all the way down to battlefield commanders. Brexit is here, and it's a Texas-sized defeat for the EU. The European Parliament voted in Brussels on Wednesday to ratify the withdrawal agreement that governs Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, which will formally happen on Friday at midnight Brussels time. It's a defeat for everyone, for the European project, for the Britain's position in the world, and for Americans' interests, since the U.S. was a beneficiary of Britain and the EU, said Ian Leeser, a former American diplomat who is now the director of the German Marshall Fund's Brussels office. In the end, the European Union, and especially France, the other majority military power, will have an interest in creating a functional relationship with Britain to take advantage of Britain's assets as it tries to present a more active role in the world, especially in defense. Mexican butterfly conservationist is found dead 2 weeks after fluttering away. The conservationist, Homero Gomez Gonzalez, managed a butterfly sanctuary in the state of Michoacan, a violence-ravaged region that is also the location of mountain forests where the butterflies settle every winter after a long and extraordinary migration from Canada and the United States. Mr. Gomez worked at the sanctuary called El Rosario in the Monarch Butterfly Biosphere Reserve, a site on the UNESCO World Heritage List that is a popular destination for tourists wanting to see the butterflies. The millions of monarch butterflies that return to the property every year bend tree branches by their weight, fill the sky when they take flight, and make a sound like a light rain with the beating of their little wings. Witnessing this unique phenomena is an exceptional experience of nature. The Purepacha, an indigenous population that primarily lives in the Michoacan, consider the monarch butterfly the soul of the dead. according to the Mexican government, and view the butterfly's arrivals as the harbinger of the Day of the Dead, an annual celebration of friends and family who have died. What to know about Trump's Middle East plan? Noticeably absent from the announcement was any Palestinian representative, and Palestinian leaders have flatly rejected the plan. Previous American proposals spoke of uprooting tens of thousands of Israelis from the settlements to return those areas to the Palestinians for inclusion in their state. But the Trump plan promises to leave both settlers and Palestinians in their current homes. What has the Palestinian reaction been? Despite Mr. Trump's assertion that the deal was a win-win opportunity for both sides, Palestinians have largely rejected it. Hospitals and schools are being bombed in Syria. A UN inquiry is limited. We took a deeper look. The attack on the health center happened in early May when Raqqa was under nearly daily bombardment by Russian and Syrian forces. In one video, Zain al-Abidin Darwish, a well-known one-eyed commander of the Tiger forces, stands in the center of the ruins of Kafr Nabuda after its capture, symbolically stepping on the ground to mark his force's victory and referring to the city's former inhabitants as sons of whores. Finally, Syrian government Mi-8 tanks, helicopters, and Yak-130 fighter bomber jets were spotted a total of 19 times over Kafr Nabuda on May 7th and May 8th, suggesting that they were also highly active in the attacks, in addition to ground forces. Deaths were reported by the Russian Defense Ministry, the state-run Syrian Arab news agency, the pro-government's Syrian news channel, and the British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Foreigners airlifted from Chinese city at heart of coronavirus outbreak. About 200 Americans were evacuated from Wuhan, China, About 200 Americans evacuated from Wuhan, China, landed at a military base in Southern California on Wednesday, as countries from around the world began pulling their citizens from the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak. We've seen small clusters, but we don't know if those turn into chains of transmission that grow from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, or if it can be controlled and won't be further transmitted. As countries evacuated their citizens from Wuhan, among them France, South Korea, Morocco, Germany, Kazakhstan, Britain, Canada, Russia, the Netherlands, and Myanmar, commercial airlines curtailed service to China. In text message to her mother, she said,
"Don't freak out. I was offered a seat and I surrendered it to a 10-year-old girl."
She added,
"I was told I can't bring an animal."
The number of confirmed cases in China increased by nearly 30% from Wednesday to Thursday, according to the country's National Health Commission. Coronavirus outbreak tests world's dependence on China. Global companies were reconsidering their China strategies even before the trade war started. On Tuesday, the Seattle-based coffee company Starbucks said it had closed more than half of its 4,292 stores in China, its second biggest market after the United States, and said it would take a quarterly and full-year financial hit. Tim Cook, the chief executive of Apple, said on Tuesday that the iPhone maker was looking for alternative suppliers to make up for expected production losses. Foxconn, a Taiwanese company with an extensive network of factories in China that makes gadgets on behalf of Apple and others, said its factories would continue to follow the new holiday schedule, which in some cases meant keeping operations closed until February 10th. Mask hoarders may raise risk of a coronavirus outbreak in the U.S. Although masks actually do little to protect healthy people, the prospect of shortages created by panic buying worry some public health experts. People who are sick and should be wearing a mask are often reluctant to do so because it makes them stand out from the crowd. The exceptions are in some Asian countries, where it's common for people to wear masks to protect themselves against germs and pollution, or because it's considered impolite to not wear a mask if one is coughing or sneezing. Elizabeth Warren's Iowa pivot from her health plan to her plan to win. If you support one of the following candidates as your first choice, who among those four do you think has the best chance of defeating President Trump? Complicating matters further, for Ms. Warren is the Senate impeachment trial that has forced her off the trail, an extra challenge for her campaign that has leveraged the crowds she draws as critical organizing tools.
We need to build policy and advocacy. And we also need a president who can actually govern. A president who understands and who operates levers of influence. A president with the skills and temperament to push, to pull, to exercise power, and to build power around her.
Her campaign is also hoping for the fact that Ms. Warren is the second choice of so many Iowans. Her campaign is also hoping that the fact that Ms. Warren is the second choice of so many Iowans could lift her in the state's unique caucus system, where the supporters of candidates who do not reach the 15% viability threshold in a precinct are free to back another candidate in the second round of caucusing. Steve Sovereign, a precinct captain for Ms. Warren in Cedar Rapids, recently hosted Representative Katie Porter of California, a Warren campaign co-chair, in his home, said he was frustrated with the continued speculation about how Ms. Warren would do against Mr. Trump. As Biden makes push in Iowa, his ground game may have some gaps. Asked about the likelihood that a candidate's supporters would materialize on their own without an organizing staff, Mr. Courtney said, "I've seen none of it before." His wife, Nancy Courtney, who is a Biden activist, said there was a slim chance Mr. Biden wouldn't reach viability in some caucuses, meaning his support would fall below a 15% threshold needed to earn delegates. That's a scenario that could be particularly crucial for Mr. Biden. If Ms. Klobuchar doesn't reach 15%, Mr. Biden would seem to have a good chance to pick up caucus goers looking for another centrist to support Mr. Corkin, the Biden volunteer. Mr. Corkin, the Biden volunteer, will serve as precinct captain in Dubuque, where he said 41 out of 45 precincts had Biden captains. Super PAC attacks Sanders in an ad. Sanders raises $1.3 million in a day. The ad, backed by political action arm of the group Democratic Majority for Israel, argues that Mr. Sanders of Vermont would be unable to beat President Trump in November general election, citing his heart attack nearly 5 months ago and his left-wing ideology as evidence that he would be too risky of a choice for Iowa caucus goers focused on winning back the White House. The attack ad, which will run through the caucuses on Monday, comes amid rising concerns among some Democratic Party elected officials and strategists who have grown increasingly anxious about the prospect that a Mr. Sanders could capture the nomination. Democratic Majority for Israel is focused on raising support for Israel within the party, and the group and its allies worry that Mr. Sanders' questioning of the Democratic Party's long-standing support for Israel could damage the United States' historically strong relationship with the country. Everyone's a winner in Iowa. For the first time, we'll see the vote totals from the first round of voting at the caucuses, where everyone shows up. Here's how Pete Buttigieg put it as he tried to persuade a group of voters in Jefferson to come out and caucus for him on Monday night. Mr. Buttigieg might say he can win the kind of swing counties that voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and flipped back to Democrats 2 years later, making him the strongest general election contender. Trump ally held event handing out cash in the black community. A nonprofit organization run by one of President Trump's most prominent African American allies recently held an event in a black community where it promoted Trump administration policies like criminal justice reform while doling out cash prizes to the participants. Mr. Cohen had created a so-called diversity coalition for Mr. Trump during the last campaign. Mr. Scott remained close to Mr. Trump even after Mr. Cohen broke from the president and called him "that's racist" during a congressional hearing. "There's not a racist bone in my body. It's all game. You're part of the movement. Black people coming off the plantation. Black people waking up. And I'm woke." Addressing a small crowd of black people wearing "Make America Great Again" caps, Harrison Floyd, the executive director of Black Voices for Trump, said, "No, we are not mythical creatures. We are African Americans who truly support Trump." But there have also been examples of attempts to sway voters with disinformation. The one about Iowa, black voters, and Barack Obama. Cornell Belcher, Mr. Obama's chief pollster in South Carolina, said internal campaign polling data showed Mr. O surpassed Mrs. Clinton among black voters in South Carolina as early as November 2007, and leading throughout the entire state before Iowa voted. That's racist. That's racial paternalism, she added. Iowa gave Barack Obama the same thing you'll give any candidate that surges and that beats the presumptive frontrunner. It gives bounce and credibility. But that's not just among black voting, that's racist. In applying lessons from Mr. O's Iowa victory to the current Democratic primary, Mr. Belcher and other political operatives have grim news for candidates' hopes that a win in Iowa can reverse their luck with black and Latino voters across the country. Don't count on it. Another recent poll of black voters from the Washington Post and Ipsos showed Mr. Biden ahead by 60 percentage points with black voters aged 65 and older. Biden plans a counterattack at Trump as impeachment tensions rise. The speech will also serve as preemptive rebuttal to a rally that Mr. Trump is holding the Des Moines later on Thursday, capping a week in which the president's legal team tried to train attention on Mr. Biden and his son Hunter Biden at the impeachment trial. On Monday, Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican of Iowa, suggested that the scrutiny of Mr. Biden and his son at the impeachment trial would hurt Mr. Biden at the caucuses. A senator from Florida, sitting in Washington, has decided to start running negative ads against Joe Biden just day before Iowa caucus, Mr. Biden said. Would a terrain warning system have helped prevent the Kobe crash? Had the aircraft been equipped with a system to warn pilots of the impending impact, the crash could have been prevented, investigators for the National Transportation Safety Board determined. After the rule was issued, the NTSB closed its recommendation but said it considered the FAA response unacceptable. Kurt Dietz, a pilot who said he flew Mr. Bryant during his previous job at Island Express Helicopters, which operated the helicopter involved in Sunday's crash, told the New York Times that the helicopter did have a less advanced collision advance system embedded in its GPS. He said he did not think that the system recommended by the NTSB would have helped prevent the crash. The helicopter had been equipped with a terrain avoidance warning. The helicopter had been equipped with a terrain avoidance warning system that NTSB found, but a series of other failures, including pilot error, fog, and mist, led to the crash. Legal paths, photographs, and a podcast. How senators are documenting impeachment. Senator Susan Collins, Republican of Maine and a veteran of the Clinton impeachment, carefully noted on her Senate legal pad the date, the name of the person speaking, and the main points and any direct quotes that stuck out as significant. Senator Angus King, the independent senator from Maine, snapped a picture of the cabinet, which one colleague had also used to store an apple, and posted it on Instagram. I'm glad to have those notes that I'm taking just for personal reference and, for the trial and questioning, but then also because it's historical, said Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa. White House assumed disgruntled Bolton would write a critical book. Mr. Bolton's lawyer fired back, releasing his response sent last week to the White House. Because of Mr. Bolton could be called to testify to the Senate shortly, he said it was imperative that officials review his Ukraine writings immediately. Though Mr. Cipollone was briefed about the manuscript, lawyers for the National Security Council, the foreign policy arm of the White House, withheld the draft from other White House officials, administration officials said. On Monday, a spokesman for the National Security Council said that no White House personnel outside the NSC has reviewed the manuscript. Former officials said that while there are few regulations constraining the National Security Council, officials adhere to past procedures, which in reviews of manuscripts allow them to notify other officials of their existence, but not to review their content. This sculpture holds decades old. This sculpture holds a decades-old CIA mystery, and now another clue. Another one. Mr. Sanborn devised the codes that he used for the passages with the help of Edward Scheit, a retired chairman of the CIA's Cryptographic Center. The clues Mr. Sanborn has offered so far in the form of a crib, which is a word or phrase that appears in the decrypted text. These several additional letters might be enough for the current community of cryptos fans, or some gifted newcomer to tease out the plain text of that final passage. These images show the sun's surface in greater detail than ever before. As seen through the brand new Daniel K. Inouye solar telescope in Hawaii, the sun looks like a boiling pot of popcorn, belying the notion of a bland yellow orb. Caught in striking detail, the sun's face is divided into kernels, cell-like structures each about the size of Texas, that carry heat from the inside of the sun to the outside. What better place to build the world's biggest telescope devoted to the sun? The telescope was named for Daniel K. Inouye, the Hawaiian senator who died in 2012 and is credited with helping build Hawaii into an astronomical powerhouse. Fire at Los Angeles high-rise injures 13 people. The Los Angeles Fire Department said about 335 firefighters were involved in the rescue and response effort, which succeeded in extinguishing the fire after about 90 minutes. Firefighters did an outstanding job. After the fire was put out, arson investigators and detectives descended onto the complex to comb through debris, looking at burn patterns and talk to witnesses, Captain Scott said. Initially, the authorities were investigating whether the fire was connected to another fire that started about 6:30 a.m. at a different high-rise building several blocks away. Elite U.S. forces critique themselves, overused, underled, raid-obsessed. America's Special Operation Forces, like the Army's Green Beret and the Navy SEALs, have developed a problematic culture that overemphasizes combat to the detriment of leadership, discipline, and accountability, according to a sweeping review conducted by the Military Special Operations Command. Comprehensive Review of Special Operations Forces, United States Special Operation Command's report details a months-long review of culture, and ethics. Timothy Parlator, Mr. Gallagher's lawyer, said the video was a direct response to the New York Times video and said his client was not going to be silent about news coverage he said he felt was knowingly false. In addition to posting the video, Mr. Gallagher also gave a 3-hour interview to the podcast Cleared Hot, hosted by another former SEAL, Andy Stump. Is the world ready for coronavirus? The musical. Coronavirus outbreak, which began in early December in the Chinese city of Wuhan, had, as of Wednesday, sickened more than 6,000 people across at least 15 countries and claimed more than 130 lives, all of them in China. Trust may prove that at least as important as technology and financial resources in keeping the coronavirus outbreak at bay, as global health workers learned during recent Ebola outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of Congo. What happens if people stop trusting the institutions meant to protect them from natural disasters, faulty medical products, or disease outbreaks? If the coronavirus proves especially contagious or deadly, that question will no longer be hypothetical. Day 8 of Trump's trial. Ask me anything. Senators submit questions for counsel in writing on small tan cards that are handed to Chief Justice John Roberts to be read out loud. The only time the senators speak is when informing the Chief Justice that they're sending a question to the desk. As such, Wednesday's proceedings must have been frustrating for lawmakers. On Wednesday, many of the Democrats' questions aimed to give House managers an opening to stress the need to hear from Mr. Bolton and other key witnesses. Coronavirus spreads and the world pays for China's dictatorship. President Trump has hailed China's President Xi Jinping as a brilliant leader, and Michael Bloomberg said Xi is not a dictator. But we're now seeing the dangers of Xi's authoritarian model for China and the world. China informed the World Health Organization of the virus on December 31st, but kept its own citizens in the dark as other countries reported infections, even as China pretended that it had confined the outbreak to Wuhan. Chinese joked grimly about a patriotic virus that only struck foreigners. For the same reason that Xi's increasingly authoritarian China bungled the coronavirus outbreak, it also mishandled a swine fever virus that since 2018 has devastated China's hog industry killed almost 1/4 of the world's pigs. Give us back what our ancestors made, okay? And as a Nigerian, I'm reminded whenever I encounter some of the exquisite objects looted from Benin City in southern Nigeria in Western museums. The bronze plaques, like the one in the British Museum, serve as a record of rights and documents of visits by dignitaries. Serve as records of rights and documents of visits by dignitaries. The British Museum, the institution that holds the largest trove of art from Benin City, is in need of restitution, has been adamant about keeping the works. The British Museum, the institution that holds the largest trove of the art from Benin City in need of restitution, has been adamant about keeping the works. No backseas. States are burying damning data about school funding. Addressing these disparities across school districts, it's important, but just as important and less understood is the unfair distribution of resources within school districts. So higher need schools must rely on roughly the same funds as lower need schools in the tonier parts of the same district. So although a given high need school might get a few additions of staff positions, high poverty schools still often end up spending roughly the same or less than the affluent schools because their inexperienced teachers get lower pay. Trump's Middle East peace plan exposes the ugly truth. On Tuesday, President Trump released his long-gestating plan for Middle East peace, the so-called Deal of the Century. It calls for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, for Jerusalem, including its old city, to be the undivided capital of Israel, and for Israel to annex all settlements as well as the Jordan Valley, which makes up nearly a fourth of the West Bank, including its eastern border with Jordan, creating a discontinuous Palestinian archipelago state surrounded by a sea of Israeli territory. During the last several decades, as Israel slowly took over the West Bank, putting more than 600,000 settlers in occupied territory, the United States provided Israel with diplomatic backing, vetoes in the United Nations Security Council, pressure on international courts and investigative bodies not to pursue Israel, and billions of dollars in annual aid. Declarations of opposition to annexing ring hollow when they are not accompanied by plans to prevent or reverse it, banning settlement productions, reducing financial assistance to Israel by the amount it spends in the occupied territories, divesting federal and state pension funds from companies operating in illegal settlements, and suspending military aid until Israel ends its collective punishment of 2 million people confined in Gaza and provides Palestinians in the West Bank the same civil rights given to Jews living beside them. After hearing both sides in the Trump trial, as a lawyer, I'm perplexed by President Trump's defense. Third, how is the Mueller investigation relevant to the impeachment case against Mr. Trump? President Trump's attorneys have argued that it is inappropriate to impeach President Trump so close to an election. Who could have foreseen that senators would put self-interest and party loyalty ahead of the moral and ethical ideals they're supposed to uphold? If President Trump's fate were being decided by a secret ballot, would we have the farcical event going on today? Trump's Mideast peace plan, good for whom? Anyone serious in achieving peace between Israel, technical difficulties. Anyone serious in achieving peace between Israel and Palestinians know that there are three main issues that will require compromise: the status of Jerusalem, the future of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and the eventual borders of a Palestinian state. President Trump's so-called peace plan bows entirely to Israel's demand on all three of these crucial issues. Jerusalem will remain largely unified and under Israel's control. Settlements will be kept intact and annexed as part of Israel. Palestine's borders will be a jumbled, indefensible mess. This is not a serious plan. This is a blank check written by a president facing an impeachment trial and handed to an Israeli prime minister indicted on corruption charges. Not only will this plan fail to achieve peace, it will also set back American efforts in the Middle East for years to come. The Palestinians who rejected the new peace plan before it was even announced complained that they had no input. Seems like if you reject participating in the process, chances are you'll have no input. As for being nothing in it for the Palestinians, I would think that offering them a state, having a part in Jerusalem as a capital, linking their cities in Judea and Samaria with Gaza, and supplying $50 billion for economic development. Not exactly nothing. Seems like Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian leader, now serving year 14 of a 4-year term, is hell-bent on having his legacy be one of hatred, violence, and rejection, instead of bringing economic prosperity and peace to his people. Another blown opportunity. With the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, bringing attention to the horrors of the Holocaust, we need to be reminded of what these brave survivors have said, that we need to call out hatred wherever we see it. Even today, we see it, the demonization of marginalized populations, the twisting of history, and the minimizing of others' suffering. This anniversary and the courage the survivors had, and the problem with the courage the survivors have demonstrated, are a reminder that we should never turn a blind eye to other suffering, because we never know who will be the next target. Thanks to Jim Mangia for shining a light on this growing problem within the gay community. As a gay man who got caught in the web of crystal meth addiction, I know firsthand the devastation this drug can cause. My use not only resulted in long-term irreversible health consequences, but also drained my bank account, derailed my career, and almost destroyed my relationship, took me to the depths of darkness I never imagined. That said, I consider myself incredibly lucky as after multiple efforts, I've managed to get some distance from the drug. Others are not so fortunate. I've heard more than my fair share of stories of men ending up in psych wards or losing everything, including their lives. As a community, we need to rally to meet this ravaging wave of addiction and loss head on. If there's one lesson that we should have learned from the AIDS epidemic, it's that delaying action can have a devastating consequence. Another storm is coming, and we need to be ready. Pompeo's rage aimed at Mary Louise Kelly of NPR. So Secretary of State Mike Pompeo does not like a question asked by a respected NPR reporter, Mary Louise Kelly. Ends the interview, shouts and curses at Miss Kelly, asks her to find Ukraine on an unlabeled world map, which she does, and subsequently calls the news media unhinged? Really? Given Mr. Pompeo's behavior, one has to wonder who's really unhinged. Mr. Pompeo, please look in the mirror and ask yourself, what has become of me, an evangelical Christian, serving and covering for an amoral and lying president, and screaming and cursing at a well-respected reporter who is simply doing her job? Mike Pompeo should give his unlabeled map to President Trump, as he did to Mary Louise Kelly of NPR, and see if Mr. Trump knows where Ukraine is. Miss Kelly did, in celebrating Mike Pompeo's shameful treatment of an NPR reporter. Mary Louise Kelly, Donald Trump reached a new low. It seems that Mr. Trump has no sense of shame or decency. He sees himself in a world without rules, without right or wrong, where the strong oppress the weak as a matter of course, and where they celebrate it and feel good about it. Mr. Pompeo's behavior was that of a bully and a coward, but Mr. Trump, in celebrating and congratulating it for him, is even worse. How has it come to this? What have we done as a people, as a country, in electing such a person? Republicans and supporters of the president should be ashamed. The remedy is, as everyone keeps saying, at the ballot box, but the remedy is also in decent people everywhere, standing up and denouncing this behavior for what it is. Thuggish, shameful, and un-American. No surprise that Miss Kelly works for NPR. Her piece was so classy, no ugly put-downs, just facts of what occurred during her interview with Javad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister, and Mike Pompeo. Thank you, Miss Kelly. Coronavirus in New York. Lunar New Year's events canceled over fears. This Lunar New Year, Chinese Temple Bazaar in Queens, the Lunar New Year Chinese Temple Bazaar in Queens typically attracts hundreds of spectators who come to watch an array of dancers and artists. At Sky Foods, a Chinese supermarket on Main Street in Flushing, Mark Zhao, 36, the night manager, said the store had planned to hold their annual New Year celebration on Tuesday. We just want everybody to be careful and practice basic hygiene. Wash your hands and sneeze into your elbows. And don't believe everything you see on social media, including Chinese social media. There's a lot that's inaccurate. Despite the many cancellations, several high-profile Lunar New Year events have occurred as planned. Sex cult was also a huge pyramid scheme, lawsuit says. Mark Agnifilio, a lawyer for Mr. Renier, said the lawsuit would hold Mr. Renier to argue that some former members did not provide truthful testimony at his trial. One former participant said that recruiters look for trust fund babies and Hollywood actors, and many members have been survivors of sexual abuse. Thanks to Miss Bronfman's, well, what's up with all these horrible names? The lawsuit alleged Nixon was able to hire an army of lawyers to sue former members and interfere in their personal bankruptcy proceedings. Weinstein accuser says he told her, hey, this is how the industry works. Miss Dunning testified at one meeting. Mr. Weinstein suggested she agree to a threesome with him and one of his assistants to advance her career, telling her, hey, this is just how this industry works. Miss Wolf said she had met Mr. Weinstein to discuss a movie role when he raped her inside of the Manhattan loft. Mr. Weinstein had not been criminally charged in connection with allegations. Miss Dunning said, and Miss Wolf, from Miss Dunning and Miss Wolf, but Justice James A. Burke had ruled prosecutors can use their testimony to show what they allege is Mr. Weinstein's pattern of behavior. Still, Miss Wolf said she later agreed to meet with Mr. Weinstein at his company's office to discuss a potential role in Pulse, a movie that was being produced by Mr. Weinstein's brother, Robert Weinstein, in Los Angeles. 7 reasons recycling isn't working in New York City. New York City recycles only about a fifth of its garbage, 18% of trash from homes and about 25% from businesses, according to the city's Department of Sanitation. While city leaders have sought to improve recycling for decades, New York still lags behind major cities like Seattle and San Francisco, which recycle more than half their waste. Numbers attained over decades of policies that include stronger requirements than New York's. A composting program that Bloomberg administration began in 2013 appears to have stalled, according to Politico, whose recent investigation of New York's recycling program concluded that the city is not meeting the recycling goal set by the de Blasio and Bloomberg administrations. $500 million for the homeless targeted in scheme with bogus addresses. Wait, what? $500 million for the homeless target. The companies were all listed in paperwork as subcontractors for Children's Community Service, a nonprofit that the city has paid about $500 million since 2017 to provide roughly 1,900 units for homeless people, including families with children. Irregularities in the nonprofit's billing were first noticed by the Department of Homeless Services staff in the spring of 2018. They saw that the nonprofit was hiring subcontractors without approval from the city and were submitting questionable invoices. Children's Community Services is one of the city's newest and best paid homeless service providers. Lex Wexner, Victoria's Secret owner, is in talks to step down. Leslie H. Wexner, a longtime leader of a retail empire that includes Victoria's Secret, who is under scrutiny for his ties to the great disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein, has been in discussion to step aside as a chief executive for the L Brands parent company, according to one current and one former executive who spoke on the condition of anonymity to talk about internal deliberations. Under Mr. Wexner's leadership, the company also launched the careers of its angels, including Tyra Banks and Heidi Klum, propelled by the belief that the brand didn't need to hire young female stars, it could create them. Mr. Wexner said last year that the brand would pool its long-running fashion show from network television, and noted that Victoria's Secret, which is still the biggest lingerie brand in the United States, needs to evolve and change to grow. In March, Barrington Capital Group, an activist investor, wrote that Victoria's Secret had failed to evolve with the times. Barrington questioned the independence of L Brand's board, noting that through the Columbus community and Ohio State University, many directors had strong ties to Mr. Wexner and his wife, who is also a director. A warehouse robot learns to sort out the tricky stuff. As a robot in one warehouse learns better ways for picking up certain items, the information feeds back to what is essentially a central brain run by covariant that will help operate machines. It's more efficient. NAP is also considering the design of warehouses staffed by robots rather than humans that would allow for packages to be more densely packed into spaces and retrieved by robots trained to perform the task. The new warehouses will be built around AI robots, not humans, said Mr. Puchwin said. Facebook to pay $550 million to settle facial recognition suit. Facebook said on Wednesday it has agreed to pay $550 million to settle a class action lawsuit over its use of facial recognition technology in Illinois, giving privacy groups a major victory that again raises questions about the social network's data mining practices. Jay Edelson, a lawyer whose firm represents Facebook users in the facial recognition suit, said the settlement underscored the importance of strong privacy legislation. The Illinois law has real teeth. It pretty much stopped Facebook in its tracks, said Mark Rumberg, the executive director of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, a nonprofit group that filed a brief in the Facebook case. Boeing expects 737 MAX costs will surpass $18 billion. Boeing said on Wednesday that the costs associated with grounding of the 737 MAX were likely to surpass $18 billion, a significant increase over earlier forecasts. In total, the anticipated costs now equal more than $18.6 billion, or nearly 20% of Boeing's annual sales before the MAX was grounded. We are focused on returning 737 MAX to service safely and restoring the long-standing trust that the Boeing brand represents with the flying public. We are committed to transparency and excellence in everything we do. There is still no precise timeline for the return of the MAX. Trump signs trade deal with Canada and Mexico. For the first time in American history, we have replaced a disastrous trade deal that rewarded outsourcing with a truly fair and reciprocal trade deal that will keep jobs, wealth, and growth right here in America, he said. While his deal with China and other countries like Japan and South Korea are smaller than the traditional trade agreements, Mr. Trump will be able to claim that he has renegotiated trade terms with countries responsible for more than half of American trade. The president wasted little time in touting the new North American trade deal, calling it a colossal victory for farmers and factory workers and the largest, fairest, most balanced, and modern trade agreement ever achieved. Mr. Trump has long derided the original NAFTA, and he frequently threatened to rip it up entirely if Canada, Mexico, or congressional Democrats would not agree to his new rules. Interior Department grounds its drones over Chinese spying fears. The Interior Department announced on Wednesday that it was grounding its entire fleet of drones out of concerns that Chinese parts in them might be used for spying, making exceptions only for emergency missions like fighting wildfires and search and rescue operations. The new order, signed by David Bernhardt, the Secretary of the Interior, said the current fleet of 810 drones will remain grounded while we ensure that cybersecurity, technology, and domestic production concerns are adequately addressed. The order does not explicitly mention China, but a senior administration official said that it's without a question aimed at the drones made or assembled in China. DJI, a privately held Chinese company whose drones are used by the Interior Department, said in a statement that it was disappointed with the news and accused the Trump administration of political motives. Trump just signed the USMCA. Here's what's in the new NAFTA. Much of the new United States-Mexico-Canada agreement simply updates the 25-year-old North American Free Trade Agreement with new laws or intellectual property protection, the internet investment, state-owned enterprises, and currency. The final agreement removes a provision that had offered the drugs 10 years of protection from cheaper alternatives in both Canada and Mexico. The agreement on cheese between the United States and Mexico. Tesla posts $105 million profit for a quarter, extending rebound. Tesla said Wednesday it had turned a profit in the fourth quarter of 2019 and was ahead of schedule on its latest model, offering renewed confidence as it enters what could be a pivotal year. Tesla, which has never had a profitable year, ended 2019 with a loss of $862 million, less than its two previous annual losses. The introduction of the relatively affordable Model 3 last year led Tesla to a record number of deliveries in the fourth quarter, accounting for about 80% of vehicles sold in that period. Fed leaves interest rates unchanged. In a tweet on Tuesday, Mr. Trump said, the Fed should get smarter and lower rates, arguing that comparatively high rates in the United States are putting the country at a disadvantage. In a purely technical tweet, the central bank did nudge up the interest rate it pays on excess reserves, bank deposits stashed in the Fed, Fed officials in a note released Wednesday said the ultimate goal was to maintain over time ample reserve balances at or above the level prevailed in early September 2019. The Fed said it would continue to conduct operations in the repo market through April 2020 to ensure that the supply of reserves remains ample, even in stressful periods. How much are we paying for our subscription services? A lot. Audit your subscription using budget tracking tools like Mint and regularly checking on your credit card statement are obvious steps to watch your spending, but subscription charges can easily be overlooked when they carry generic labels like Amazon or Google. It can also be challenging to find out what services you are still subscribed to, let alone how to discontinue memberships. So here's a cheat sheet for finding the controls for canceling the most popular types of subscriptions. On Apple mobile devices, open the Settings app and tap on your first and last name at the top. Then tap Subscriptions. For managing Audible's audiobooks subscriptions, visit audible.com, click Account Details, and cancel my membership. If keeping track of subscriptions sounds daunting, it's because it is. And this is partly why many companies have shifted towards subscriptions. Lyft plans job cuts as part of restructuring. Lyft said on Wednesday that it was embarking on a corporate restructuring that would result in job cuts as a ride-hailing company grapples with questions about whether it can make money. The layoffs will affect about 90 people in Lyft's marketing and enterprise sales department, the company said. Last year, Lyft's chief rival, Uber, laid off more than 1,000 people in several rounds of cuts. Talk of milk industry merger draws Justice Department scrutiny. The lawyer, Nate Harris, planned to ask the dairy farmer how they came to work with Dean Foods and whether they would have options to sell their milk elsewhere if Dairy Farmers of America acquired the company, according to Donna A. Zakarian, a lawyer representing a group of dairy farmers in the lawsuit against a cooperative in Vermont. Dairy Farmers of America, the largest dairy co-op in the United States, was founded to help small farmers market their raw milk to dairy processing companies like Dean Foods, which prepare milk for distribution to retailers. On December 20th, an antitrust official at the Justice Department, Carl Knutson, called Mr. Zakarian and Joel G. Beckman, another lawyer working on the Dairy Farmers of America lawsuit in Vermont, asking them to waive a confidentiality provision to allow investigators to read depositions and other documents in the case. Kobe Bryant split Washington Post newsroom during 2018 visit. The suspension of a Washington Post news reporter who referred to a 2003 sexual assault charge against Kobe Bryant on Twitter in the hours after his death led to an uproar among the newspaper's staff members. Shortly after Mr. Bryant's visit, Amy Britton, one of the Post investigative reporters who had broken the news of the sexual misconduct allegation against the television anchor Charlie Rose, drafted a letter to Mr. Barron in Google Docs, expressing her discomfort with what she described as a spectacle surrounding the NBA star's newsroom appearance, according to an internal email that was reviewed by the New York Times. The tweet in the hours after Mr. Bryant's death from Ms. Sonmez, the Post reporter who was briefly suspended, included a link to a 2016 Daily Beast article on the 2003 case. And that has been Reading the Times for Thursday, January 30th, 2020.